So let's open the second half of this talk, the question and answer session, with a little prayer, because we like to pray. We're Catholics. So we're just gonna say the St. Michael prayer in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. Amen. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle. Be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray. And do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, cast into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl throughout the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Amen. Okay, so the sad thing is that I'm not going to be able to answer all of these questions because I got so many questions. But that's the good thing, because I got a lot of questions. So you guys are listening. Thank you. Appreciate it. And some of the questions are going to take quite a bit of time to answer. So I got everything from, questions specifically about COVID to questions about childhood vaccines to questions about, other tangential issues. So I'm going to deal with some of the simpler ones first. Because someone asked if any of the polio vaccines did not use aborted fetal tissue. And so let me explain a little bit more about what happened there with Sabin, because there was another question too. Somebody asked, well, what about the monkey cells and the SV40 virus with the polio vaccine, right? So Sabin in the 30s through the 50s. So I have the papers, I have the citations. In fact, they're also available on childrenofgodforlife.org, which is COGFOR life.org. If you're not familiar with Children of God for Life, they are the place to go right now to find out which vaccines are ethical in terms of not being abortion associated versus which vaccines are abortion associated, and specifically which cell lines were used. And they've got all the citations. So if your neighbor or your priest or whoever is like, no, this is just, it's a conspiracy theory that there's aborted fetal cells being used in vaccines, you can send them there. You can also send them to the website of Dr. Teresa Deisher, which is Deisher. So that's Deisher. She runs Sound Choice Pharmaceuticals. She has done a lot of research actually looking at the connection between aborted fetal vaccines and autism. So she actually traced, I saw a talk of hers on YouTube. Again, trying to find her on YouTube in the age of the cancel culture is going to be a little bit difficult, but her papers are on her website, and she did a short clip that's with Del Bigtree on the Highwire. And, again, if you're wanting to keep on top of the news, I recommend him. Of course, with the caveat that he's, got some interesting mannerisms and some interesting political opinions, but at least he will show you, here's the article that I'm reading, and when he tells you what's in the article, he will tell you what's actually in the article, so you can then, it's a good jumping off point. So but she actually was charting the increase in autism incidence versus the increase in aborted fetal vaccines over time, and noticed that every time there was an additional aborted fetal vaccine added to the schedule, there was an increase in the rate of autism, and that increase seemed to be dose dependent. So it was twice as much if you added 2 aborted fetal vaccines to the schedule. And so then the CDC stopped reporting the data the way that they were reporting it, so she could no longer track that properly in like 2000, I want to say 8, but it was a while ago. So she did some pretty groundbreaking research there, and it's really kind of horrifying. But she's very much, she discusses the fact that the chickenpox vaccine in particular, so the chickenpox vaccine was made using aborted fetal cells. I believe that one was, it was either MRC-5 or PERC-6, I think. It might have been WI-38, but the cell lines on Children of God for Life, the vaccines contain twice as much aborted fetal DNA as chickenpox virus. The chickenpox vaccine contained twice as much aborted fetal DNA as chickenpox virus. And while we're talking about aborted fetal DNA and vaccines, and also talking about genetic concerns, there's a phenomenon called homologous recombination, where DNA that matches can kind of line up and swap out. It's one of the reasons that you don't have just the traits of your grandmother. You'll have a mixture of the traits of your grandmother and grandfather on both sides. when you get injected with small fragments of human DNA, that can also happen. So kids who've received aborted fetal vaccines might actually be carrying DNA from the cell line that they were vaccinated, or the vaccine was developed in. So we've actually been genetically modifying people accidentally for a long time. So the original polio vaccine, the papers that go back to the 30s and the 50s, the cell lines that Sabin was trying to produce ended up not being successful. So the virus or the vaccine that was cultured in the cells was actually cultured in monkey cells. And so a lot of people will say, well, wait, then wasn't it not abortion tainted? Well, you know, when you're when you're looking at things like this, I use a cake analogy sometimes, you know, so say I'm telling my spouse how much flour and sugar and all that I use to make a cake so that we can budget for groceries properly. But the first time I tried to make the cake, somebody called me in the middle and it burned, and so I threw that one away. And then the second time I made the cake, the toddler came and grabbed the tablecloth and spilled everything on the floor, and so I threw that one away. And then the third time I was trying to make a cake, I forgot to put the salt in, and so it was terrible, and so I threw that one away. And then the fourth time I made a cake, well, that one was good. But then I tell him, oh, I just made one cake. That doesn't actually properly account for what was done. So when you're looking at the way that research is being done in the development of this vaccine, specifically, you know, from the beginning to the end, there were quite a few abortions that happened because he was trying multiple times to develop aborted fetal cell lines. And even though he didn't culture the final product in the aborted fetal cell lines, he's the one who married the aborted fetal cell technology with the vaccine manufacturing. And you can't just ignore that. So the Salk vaccine, as far as I know, the one that gets injected, the inactivated, not the oral, is probably ethical. I have a book sitting on my shelf that I need to read about Jonas Salk that I figured would give me a lead one way or the other. But the oral one, the one that was on the sugar cube, was the one that started out with aborted fetal research in the 1930s. So, but it was eventually cultured, as I said, in the monkey cells. And there was a virus that, so viruses are tiny and simple as far as life goes, you know, but again, too complicated to put together in a test tube. Viruses are very small, and if you don't know what you're looking for, you won't find it. So they didn't know that there was the simian virus 40 was in these Vero monkey cells. And the first generation of oral polio vaccines were contaminated with SV40. So if you got, I don't remember which years it is, but if you got them in the particular years they were culturing them in those contaminated cells, you also got SV40. And SV40 has been associated with a lot of human cancers. So this is a big controversy / scandal. And I haven't, this is the part of so I'm working on an updated version of the vaccine book. Is going to have an entire chapter on polio. Unfortunately, this is the one part of polio I haven't read yet. But the polio vaccine gets mentioned a lot because people aren't like, well, didn't that save us from this terrible epidemic? Well, part of the problem with saying that is that it's just not actually historically accurate, because the hunt for a polio vaccine was really handicapped by the understanding of disease epidemiology at the time, which basically they took Koch's postulates and ran with them so far that they thought that if you had one disease, it had one cause. Now, you know that's not true even if you haven't thought it through all the way yet, but you know it's not true because if I'm coughing and sneezing and I have a sore throat, what disease do I have? Do I have the flu? Do I have COVID? Do I have a cold? Do I have... Go down the list, right? So a physical manifestation of disease does not always have one cause, one set of physical manifestations. And one cause does not always cause one set of physical manifestations. So that was not really the way that medical thinking was working at the time. It was one disease, one cause. So if the polio virus causes any poliomyelitis, which is actually the disease polio, if the virus causes any polio, therefore we found the cause for polio, and if we get a vaccine, we'll eliminate all the causes of polio. Paralytic poliomyelitis, properly so called, is caused by at least 12 or 14 different things, some of which include heavy metal poisoning. So arsenic poisoning or lead poisoning. And at the time that they started seeing the first polio cases in the United States, it was in an area where they were spraying with a compound called Paris green, which is a lead-based pigment that was being used as an insecticide. So, and they also noticed that the polio really ramped up around the end of World War II, right? And so there was this theory that, well, the soldiers got sick and they brought back, some sort of new polio variant or whatever, and that was the problem. Well, the soldiers also brought back a chemical called DDT, and it's the experience of my good friends out in the farming community in Montana that when the DDT went away, the kids didn't have polio anymore. So again, that's anecdotal. If you get enough anecdotes, you have data. So there will be a lot more on polio in the updated version of the vaccine book, but it's not as simple as this vaccine saved us from this terrible paralytic disease. And especially because the people that report things in the media would never manipulate us. I know we all know this. Never. There's no manipulation at all. So clearly when they show you a picture, that iconic picture, where you see like 50 iron lungs all in one room, that's what all the hospitals look like, right? No. Not a single hospital looked like that. Those were put together in an auditorium for that photo op. There was 1 or maybe 2 iron lungs at any given hospital in any given city, because the vast majority of people that got polio never got paralyzed. Most of them never had symptoms. The very, very tiny amount that had symptoms, most of those resolved on their own. And then the very, very tiny amount of those that did not, a fraction of those guys ended up in iron lungs. But when you hear polio, you think iron lung, because those two things have been associated visually. You've been given an icon. Okay? And that the truth of that icon has impressed itself on your consciousness over and over and over again, but that's not actually what happened. And then when you look at the graph, because there's always a graph they show you, and the polio cases are up here, and then here came the vaccine right here, and then they went like this. Okay, yeah, sure, that actually did happen. But what the graph doesn't tell you is that before we had a polio vaccine, if you had any paralysis at all, you were diagnosed with polio. After we had a polio vaccine, you had to be paralyzed for 60 days before you were given an official diagnosis of polio. And this has happened in the last 3 years too. It happened with COVID. Before we had a COVID vaccine, if you had any symptoms, or if you had a positive test, or if, your grandmother had symptoms, you had COVID. After the vaccine was released, you had to have a positive test and symptoms, which is a lot more reasonable. That's going to automatically eliminate a bunch of COVID cases. Just like the redefinition of polio automatically eliminated a bunch of polio cases. So it wouldn't have mattered if we had a vaccine that year or not. We would have seen that drop because we redefined what polio was. So I could say another hour of things about polio, but other people ask questions, so I should be fair and answer those. So somebody asked, why do we use cell lines from embryos? Okay, there are a couple of biological reasons and a political one, and I'll leave it to you to decide which is more reasonable. So if you start with fetal cells, the idea is that you will have fewer mutations accumulated in those cells over time, because as your cells divide, they accumulate mutations over and over and over again. You only pass about 100 of those down to your offspring, but you accumulate way more than 100 in your body. So that was one thought. Another thought is that now you've got tissue that's ideally never been infected with any kind of bacteria or any kind of virus, so you're not going to have to worry about these viral contamination situations like with SV40. But another line of thinking, and this is the political reason, if you make a lot of money from cells from an aborted baby, who's going to come after you and ask for a share of that money? Who's going to sue you? No one. The parents didn't want that baby. They said, take it out, kill it. That tissue is now not associated with any family line, with anyone who would want to go back and protect the rights of that individual. So I'll again leave you to decide which of those reasons is actually the most motivating. And somebody asked, I won't do that question yet. I think somebody asked where to find which vaccines are made using aborted fetal cells, and I think I said that already. It's Children of God for Life. Someone else asked if these vaccines, even if they're immoral, are they at least effective? And so that brings up a couple of different points. One of which is not biology, but I'm going to talk about it anyway because I'm a confirmed Catholic, and as such, I have a duty to talk about the faith as I have learned it. And it's been passed on to me. The question that I would ask in response to anybody, because I'm sure that this person isn't arguing that means we should use them, but if someone did argue that means that we should use them, then the question that needs to be asked back to that person is, well, can I do good or can I do evil that good may come of it? And it is the long-standing teaching of the Catholic Church that I cannot do evil that good may come of it. Most of us are familiar with this in terms of tubal pregnancies. You can't just go in and kill the baby with the purpose of killing the baby. That's not morally licit. And you can't use aborted fetal cells, even if the medicine was absolutely life-saving. And it's not just me saying this. You can actually find this in the Catechism of the Council of Trent. Now, they don't use the words aborted fetal cells, but in the very end, where they're discussing the Our Father, towards the very end, the petition, of course, is deliver us from evil. And one of the evils, of course, that has been around since the fall of Adam is sickness. Right? So they talk very specifically about sickness and about medicines in this explanation of the petition, deliver us from evil in the Our Father, and how Christians should flee from remedies, even if they are certain of physical deliverance, if that remedy is evil. If it is associated with something that is evil. So it is literally right there in the Catechism of the Council of Trent, but nobody reads that anymore. And then people want to argue, well, if it doesn't say aborted fetal cells, then it's okay, right? So we're not God. God has the ability to bring good out of evil, but man does not have the ability to do evil in order that good may come of it, because man is fallen and we're liable to make mistakes. We're also liable to choose ends that are not actually good, but think that they're good. So we can't do that. And then I had another question. Well, what about other childhood vaccines? Are there vaccines that are effective? And I would come back to that with another question, and that question would be, what do you mean by effective? If you mean by effective that when giving the chickenpox vaccine, we no longer have chickenpox circulating very much in the population, then yes, that was effective. But if you mean by effective actually preserving or protecting the health of the individual, I'll just say a few things about the chickenpox vaccine. Don't think I'm picking on chickenpox. There's others I could pick on too. The chickenpox vaccine does not provide lifelong immunity. Actually, neither does exposure to chickenpox, which we'll get to in a second. So what it does is it provides immunity to the child at the time in which the child's body is actually disposed to properly deal with the chickenpox virus. Once you get too old, definitely once you're into your 20s, but I think even your late teens, maybe as early as right after puberty, your body can no longer process the chickenpox virus properly, and you're more likely to have, not shingles, you're more likely to have complications like encephalitis, which is swelling in the brain. So I know a young man who in his 20s contracted chickenpox and ended up in the hospital and almost died. Now, all of you seem to be either old enough to have had chickenpox yourselves or had children who had chickenpox or both. And so from your own memory, dig back, when did you hear of a child dying of chickenpox? Right? And so even when the chickenpox vaccine was instituted, it wasn't for the sake of public health so much as for the sake of, we want to spare the parents the time that it would take to take off work to nurse their children. So it was entirely an economic reason. And this is in peer-reviewed literature. You can find it out there. It's not too hard. So that was the thinking. They weren't actually thinking about the health of the population or the health of the individual. So the individual is exposed to this tremendous risk. Well, what about the parents who vaccinate their children for chickenpox? Well, they're also exposed to a risk because they're not nursing their children through chickenpox. Because remember I just said that natural immunity to chickenpox isn't forever? So when your kids get chickenpox, you get boosted. And if you don't get boosted, then you get shingles. So we're seeing shingles cases earlier and earlier in younger and younger people, and they're worse and worse cases because there's no natural chickenpox, well, very little natural chickenpox virus circulating in our communities right now. Okay, so what about kids who don't get the chickenpox vaccine? Well, they actually shouldn't play with kids who've just been vaccinated with the chickenpox vaccine because they can get the vaccine virus, which is actually different from the natural virus. But vaccines, live viral vaccines, do shed. You can get measles from someone who's been vaccinated with the measles because that virus is replicating in the body, and as it replicates in the body, the person who's been vaccinated is developing an immune response. If it replicates beyond a certain level, then the person has sufficient viral load to actually give it to someone else. So this kind of all goes back to something called equilibrium kinetics. And I see my good biology student over here nodding her head. Yeah, I got this. Basically, for things to happen, in that complicated system of homeostasis, maintaining your body's internal environment, if you have a single particle of something, it actually does nothing, basically, in your body. You have to have a sufficient number of particles to drive forward the on state of whatever that particle is doing versus the off state. So basically you have let's look at the spike protein. The spike protein can either be bound to the ACE2 receptor or other receptors in your body, or it can be not bound to those receptors. Well, if I have one spike protein floating around in my body, it's not going to bind to anything. There's not enough of it. Only once the concentration gets high enough will that protein even start binding to my cells. If it doesn't get high enough, my body will just clear it. It'll wash through the interstitial fluid. It'll get filtered out in the kidneys. It's not a big deal. And the same is true with pathogens of our immune system. This is why you don't get sick again. So you had chickenpox as a kid, you get exposed to chickenpox again. There's not enough viral particles in you because your immune system's taking care of them to actually cause disease to progress. And so it's all about equilibrium kinetics, and this relates to a lot of health issues. But we'll come back to that one again. So, are childhood vaccines effective? Well, they are effective in eliminating certain disease circulation in the population, but it's questionable whether eliminating that circulation is good for individuals or good for populations. In the case of chickenpox vaccine, I think it's a clear-cut example. It's not good for the person being vaccinated or for the population. Regarding the other childhood vaccines, I would say the ones that are abortion tainted are real easy. I can't do evil in order that good may come of it. None of them are actually for diseases that are going to kill you anyway. So even if you wanted to make the remote material cooperation argument, you can't really make it for measles. You can't really make it for chickenpox. You can't even make it for rubella because people try to make it for rubella based on the phenomenon of congenital rubella syndrome. So if a pregnant woman gets rubella, that's serious. That's extremely serious for her unborn child. You can have all kinds of birth defects. You can have stillbirths. You can have all this other thing, but the pregnant woman is the one that needs to be protected from rubella, not your kid necessarily. Although if your kid is, it slows the circulation of rubella in the population. But because the rubella vaccine is not particularly effective, it only gives about 85% herd immunity. And before we started vaccinating, we were already at 80%, which is sufficient to slow the spread of the virus about as much as it's going to be slowed, unless we can eliminate it completely. So we were already there, and once the vaccine was introduced, the congenital rubella cases didn't drop, they spiked. They went up, probably because of vaccine shedding. And then they went down in 1973. When it became legal to abort your congenital rubella syndrome baby. So, yeah, there's no argument for using the aborted fetal vaccines. There's just not. Even that one falls absolutely totally flat. There are a couple of diseases that you really, and I'm sorry, I forget which ones they are off the top of my head, but you really want to be able, if you're not going to vaccinate, you want to be able to have good care. You want to have a good doctor on the line who's willing to treat things like whooping cough. In particular, that's one of them, and there's another one that's a little bit dicey like that. But polio, there's no polio in the U.S. The last case of paralytic polio was from the vaccine in like the 1980s. Why? Why would we do that? There's no reason to. And you know, hepatitis B for an infant. Hepatitis B for an infant. The way you get hepatitis B is drug use or promiscuous behavior. So infants aren't at risk for that, unless your caregiver has hepatitis B, and then there's a possibility of passing it along, but that's like 1% of parents. So why are we vaccinating 100% of, well, not 100%, but, you know, trying to vaccinate 100% of infants for this disease when they're not at risk of contracting it? And that vaccine has so much aluminum in it that it's unreal. It's one of the highest doses of aluminum. They give it on the first or second day of life. Aluminum is neurotoxic, and the aluminum adjuvants in vaccine can cross the blood-brain barrier. And remember, it doesn't stay in your arm. You have a lymphatic system. It's going to wash it right up to your brain. And the half-life of that, I think, if I remember correctly, is somewhere around 7 to 10 years. Wow. Like, it will persist in the body for over a decade. And it will affect neurological development for over a decade. So there's no real reason to give an infant a hepatitis B vaccine either. And they also have one of the highest rates of adverse events according to VAERS data. As I'm going through and crunching the numbers, I was kind of surprised to see that jump off the page at me. The other thing that's really important about this too is just, you know, when you give this to an infant on the first day of life, you don't have a baseline. You don't know what that baby would have been like without that vaccine. And one of the reasons that people think that the COVID vaccines are so much more dangerous than all the other vaccines is because of all the VAERS reports, right? Like hundreds of thousands of VAERS reports in the first year. Like more, there were more VAERS reports, I think, on the COVID vaccine alone than from 1990 to 2020 in VAERS. I have to go back over those numbers again, but I think it was like, when you looked at it, total from 1990 to 2021, it was like 50% COVID vaccines. It was ridiculous. But if you don't have a baseline, how do you report an adverse reaction? If you don't know what that kid would have been like if you've never vaccinated them, how do you even know that they're having a reaction? So that's an important thing to consider when we consider the relative safety of vaccines. It's not actually, I mean, the COVID vaccine is more dangerous, but it's not actually that much more dangerous. It's that other vaccines are even more underreported, because a kid who's pre-verbal can't tell you, I have a dull headache and that's why I'm crying. And clearly, you know, that might be indicative of brain swelling, and therefore you should write into VAERS and tell them not to give anybody else the hepatitis B vaccine. You know, it just doesn't work that way. So that's one of the things I think people need to keep in mind when they think about vaccine safety. So a lot of the vaccines that are subunit vaccines, and again, that list is in my book. I don't have it off the top of my head because there's so many different ones, but if it's a subunit vaccine, it's going to have what's called an adjuvant, which is Latin for helper. Those adjuvants are primarily aluminum, and then that aluminum is going to do all the terrible things that we just said. It's going to be neurotoxic, it's going to persist for a long time, it's going to affect development. And your body doesn't have a natural way to remove aluminum, because aluminum is not something that you encounter naturally. We didn't really start being exposed to a whole lot of aluminum until we started digging it out of the ground and purifying it and putting it in things like tinfoil and deodorant and vaccines. So it's just not a good situation. So somebody asked also if I've given vaccines to my kid, can I fix any damage that was done? And that is going to depend in part on the vaccine that was given. But again, I do have a little bit of hope to offer you, especially for aluminum adjuvants. So there's a guy named Dr. Christopher Exley, who I recommend even less than Del Bigtree in terms of his personality. But he has spent the last 30-something years working on aluminum, and working specifically on aluminum toxicity in biological systems. So he started with fish, and he moved up to people, and he looked at aluminum in brains of people that had Alzheimer's. He looked at aluminum in brains of people that had autism, and oddly enough, he found aluminum in all of the the neurodamaged brains and none of the not neurodamaged brains, and in very high concentrations. And so he did a couple of experiments. One was on patients that had Alzheimer's. He had them drink silica-rich mineral water for 12 weeks. And if you don't remember the chemical, it actually doesn't help to get it as a supplement anyway. It has to be naturally in the spring water that they're drinking. So Fiji water is one good source of it. It's and there's another water, I can't remember the name of it, that's also available at like your local Target or grocery store or whatever. Don't shop at Target, never mind, your local grocery store. So it's a very simple, a somewhat expensive remedy because Fiji water is not cheap, but very simple and actually not terribly expensive when you look at the benefit. But he recorded that all of the people that were drinking the silica-rich mineral water were excreting more aluminum, and 20% over 12 weeks, 20% of those Alzheimer's patients experienced improved cognitive function. And now 20% doesn't sound like a lot, but this is Alzheimer's, and it was only 12 weeks. So he did another experiment with MS patients and found the same thing, that they were excreting more aluminum when they were drinking the water that was high in silica or silicic acid, which is what it is when it's dissolved. Again, we have an anecdote, but there was a woman who continued after the 12 weeks of the study to drink the mineral water, and her MS went basically into remission and did not come back out. So she was no longer progressing with the MS symptoms, and she had had progressive MS previously. So that's also really remarkable, even though it's only one individual. So this is an easily accessible item, even if it has not as much effect as Exley's claiming it has. If it has a little bit of effect, I think it's worth giving a try. I started drinking it myself. So
What is his last name?
Exley, Exley. He lost tenure for the autism research, by the way.
Wow. He's an MD?
He's a PhD. Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's just like Andrew Wakefield.
Yeah. So someone asked, does the COVID vaccine actually keep one from getting COVID worse than they would have gotten COVID had they not been vaccinated? Well, that's the line, right? You say the line. Well, I got COVID, but it would have been worse if I hadn't been vaccinated. I don't think there's really any evidence for that. But unfortunately, I don't think there's really any evidence in terms of like actual studies against that either, because nobody's collecting the evidence. And this comes back to one of the other problems with clinical trials. If I don't monitor it, it's not there. Okay, so people can say one thing or the other. I don't know how much data there is to back up either claim. Based on what I know about human physiology and the immune system in particular, if you are constantly stimulating your immune system against one particular virus, you are going to get sicker and sicker and sicker and sicker every time you get that virus. And I know that by personal experience because I have a chronic viral infection, and every time it comes out of remission, it's worse, much worse. So if you're going to dramatically overstimulate your body for this one particular virus and then expect your body to perform well when you actually get that virus in the wild, I feel like that's a probably not a really robust position to take. Somebody asked, how do I look into, I kind of answered that already, sorry. Mm-hmm.